Welcome, and let your thoughts gently drift as we slip into a slower rhythm, far from the noise of now. You've found your way to a quiet cove in time, a hidden inlet off the coast of history. Here, the wind whispers stories across still waters, and the past reveals itself not in roars or battles, but in the hush that follows them. Tonight, we sail calmly into the misty waters of maritime lore. Our compass points us toward a curious and often overlooked question: what happened to female pirates after they were caught? The image of pirates we often hold grizzled men with weathered faces and growling voices is only part of the story. Beyond the gunpowder smoke and flapping Jolly Rogers, some women also donned breeches, grasped cutlasses, and defied the conventions of their age. But when the game was up, when the tide turned and capture was certain, their fate diverged from their male counterparts in ways that are quietly telling and deeply human. We'll begin with a look at the everyday life aboard a pirate ship for a woman, not the legends, but the real moments. Quiet, wet, sunburned, and utterly adrift. From there, we'll gently drift through biographies, uncover subtle clues in trial records, explore the archaeology of forgotten coves, and even contrast life at sea with the lives of women left ashore. No storms tonight, just gentle waves of history enough to stir the mind, but not disturb your rest. So lie back, close your eyes if you like, and imagine yourself aboard a creaking wooden vessel, sails catching the wind under a bruised purple sky, somewhere between nowhere and forever. Now, let us begin. It begins, not with cannon fire, but with silence. The early morning hush aboard a pirate ship was not unlike that of any ship at sea. The waves slapped rhythmically against the wooden hull, and the salt-heavy air settled gently in the lungs. Life aboard such a vessel was a mixture of monotony and tension, the endless sway of the ship punctuated by occasional flurries of action. And for a woman in disguise, which most had to be every moment, brought a quiet demand for vigilance. Imagine the rough texture of rope beneath calloused fingers, the ever-present layer of damp on clothing never fully dry. If a woman joined a pirate crew, whether for adventure, escape, or necessity, her survival often hinged on secrecy. Many passed as men, binding their bodies, lowering their voices, blending into the crowded anonymity of a crew of 30 or 50 hardened souls. Clothing was functional coarse linen shirts, woolen breeches, perhaps a battered tricorn hat. There was no glamour in the life. Meals were sparse, hardtack softened with brine, dried salted meat, and whatever fresh fruit could be bartered or plundered. Below deck the air was thick with sweat, with mildew, with the scent of tar and oil. Hammocks swung gently, a few feet apart, offering little privacy and less comfort. Women like Anne Bonny or Mary Read, whose names have trickled into the broader memory, would have spent most days hauling lines, climbing rigging, scrubbing decks, or standing watch. There were no allowances made for gender. The work was backbreaking, and the social code was brutal. Strength and loyalty were valued, and anything less could mean being left behind, or worse. Yet, within this harshness, there were moments of stillness. Sunrises casting pink light across the endless sea, laughter shared over watered-down rum, songs hummed softly under breath as the sails flapped lazily above. In those fleeting instants, perhaps, the disguise fell away, if only within, and a sense of solitude settled in. To be a woman among men who didn't know was to live half-submerged, always listening, never fully seen. But not all chose disguise. Some women sailed openly, asserting their place with ferocity, charisma, or by the strength of their alliances. In some regions, particularly in the South China Sea or among certain Caribbean crews, female pirates were not unheard of. Their acceptance varied, shaped by the customs of the time and the character of the crew. Still, for most, the danger wasn't just from battle or law, it came from within. Discovery could mean death, or exile, or worse fates left unspoken in court records. And yet, they endured rowing beside their peers, climbing the same masts, bleeding for the same flag. As we consider their daily lives, the image becomes less romantic and more human. These were not heroines in epic tales, but individuals navigating a narrow path between survival and secrecy. The sea, for them, was both a hiding place and a test. Each sunrise brought with it another day of pretending not just to be pirates, but to be someone else entirely. And when the sails eventually lowered, and their freedom came to an end, The reckoning was shaped not only by their crimes, but by who they were beneath the disguise. Let us now drift forward into the lives behind the names and the stories etched in salt, in ink, and in silence. Let us now draw our attention to two of the most well-known female pirates in Western lore, Anne Bonny and Mary Read. Their stories have been passed down through a haze of myth, retelling, and selective memory. Yet behind the embellished tales lies a pair of lives shaped by necessity, secrecy, and the shifting tides of identity. Anne Bonny was born around 1697 in Ireland, though she was raised in the Carolinas. Her early life, already veiled in scandal due to her illegitimate birth, set a tone of defiance that carried into her adulthood. She eventually fled her arranged domestic future and found herself in Nassau, a pirate republic of sorts, where she met the infamous pirate Calico Jack Rackham. Soon, she joined his crew disguised as a man. Only a few knew her secret at first, though eventually her identity became known to select members of the ship. Mary Read's origins are similarly shrouded. She was reportedly dressed as a boy from an early age, so that her widowed mother could continue receiving support payments intended for a deceased son. This upbringing conditioned Mary to pass as male, and she continued to do so through various stages of her life as a soldier, a sailor, and eventually a pirate. She joined Calico Jack's crew disguised once again, where she encountered Anne. According to legend, Anne discovered her secret, but instead of betrayal, there bloomed a strange camaraderie. The two sailed together during the early 1720s, a period when piracy in the Caribbean had begun to wane under increasing pressure from colonial navies. Their crew plundered a handful of vessels, but their success was modest. In October of 1720, their ship was cornered by a pirate hunting sloop off the coast of Jamaica. Most of the male crew hid below decks, reportedly drunk, while Anne and Mary were said to have fought fiercely until capture was inevitable. What happened next is where history turns quieter, and perhaps more telling. The trial was swift. Held in Spanish Town, Jamaica, all crew members were found guilty of piracy, a capital offence. Most were sentenced to hang. But when Anne Bonny and Mary Read were brought forth, they revealed a shared secret. Both were pregnant. This declaration, known in legal terms as pleading the belly, granted them a temporary reprieve. It was not uncommon the British justice system, for all its severity, often paused executions for expectant mothers. The intent was not necessarily mercy, but propriety. Executing a woman with child was seen as an act against innocence. Mary Read died in prison not long after, likely from complications related to childbirth or disease. The records are vague. Anne Bonny's fate, however, dissolves into silence. Some believe her father used his influence to secure her release. Others think she quietly lived out her life in obscurity, perhaps returning to the colonies under a new name. There is no firm record of her death, and so, their stories are left trailing off, like ships vanishing beyond the horizon. What we are left with is not just two infamous pirates, but the questions they leave behind. How many others sailed in anonymity? How many escaped the noose simply because they never revealed who they were? And how many were caught, but vanished into the recordless quiet of colonial jails? Their legacy is not only in what they did, but in what the world could not decide to do with them. Pirate, woman, prisoner, mother. None of these roles fit cleanly into the systems of law and legend at the time. Now, we drift forward again, not to chase names, but to examine what little the earth itself can tell us, through buried remnants and silent clues. Let us explore the quieter evidence in archaeology. As we drift onward, the air becomes stiller, and the voices of history grow faint. When written records fail us, we look instead to the earth, to what remains buried in ports, long since silted over, in coves forgotten by charts, and in the rusting bones of ships that once danced across the sea. But the truth is this: the physical traces of female pirates are rare, not because they never existed, but because their presence was often masked by necessity, by design, or by indifference. Archaeological sites linked to piracy, particularly from the so-called Golden Age, in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, have yielded rich insights into pirate life, but seldom do they whisper clearly of women. Excavations in Nassau, New Providence, and other Caribbean hubs reveal evidence of tavern life, communal dwellings, and simple tools and utensils used by those who came ashore between raids. Clay pipes, shards of pottery, buttons, and buckles worn smooth by time and sand speak of lives lived without extravagance, often with more routine than rebellion. At Port Royal, once called the wickedest city on earth, underwater archaeology has uncovered entire sections of the sunken town that slid into the sea during the 1692 earthquake. Among the wreckage are pewter mugs, cooking pots, personal combs, and occasional trinkets items that suggest a bustling, tangled world of people coming and going. But rarely do these objects declare who owned them. Was that delicate shoe buckle a merchant's daughter's, a tavern maid's, or perhaps a pirate's? Unlike naval officers or wealthy merchants, pirates, especially female ones, left behind few personal effects that could be tied definitively to them. They rarely had marked graves, their possessions were often few and practical, and their disguises meant their identities were often layered, ambiguous, and easy to erase from the archaeological record. Still, some hints do remain. In the 1980s, a site on the coast of North Carolina revealed artifacts from the wreck of the Queen Anne's Revenge, the flagship of Blackbeard. Among the recovered items were sewing needles and thimbles, objects considered domestic by nature. While such tools were not necessarily exclusive to women, their presence on a pirate ship raised quiet questions. Were there women aboard, tending wounds or repairing garments? Or were these items simply scavenged? Other clues come from burials. In some colonial cemeteries near pirate-infested waters, graves initially marked as unknown male have, under modern forensic examination, revealed female skeletons. Some bear signs of physical strain, calloused joints, worn teeth, healed fractures suggesting hard labor, possibly at sea. Yet, without names or context, the stories remain partial, unfinished, like journals with the first pages torn away. Occasionally, graffiti carved into the walls of prison cells, especially in old colonial forts, hints at female prisoners once held within. Names etched in shaky hands, or initials paired with dates, offer the briefest of glimpses into lives now beyond reach. Were these women pirates, smugglers, or merely bystanders caught in the net? The walls offer no answers, only silence and stone. Thus, the archaeology of female piracy is a study of almost visible, almost understood, almost remembered, and perhaps that is fitting. For women who lived behind masks, beneath borrowed names, and outside the expectations of their age, their legacy was never meant to be carved in monuments or honoured in maritime museums. It was meant to move like the tide, persistent, unseen, reshaping the edges of history with each quiet wave. Now, let us step briefly away from the hidden past and into a more visible contrast between the sea and the shore, between women who defied the world aboard a ship and those who remained tethered to it by land. The sea offers no walls, no ceilings, no boundaries, but also no certainty. To step aboard a pirate vessel was to leave behind not only land, but identity, especially for a woman. Meanwhile, the women who remained ashore lived within structures more rigid than the decks their seafaring counterparts ever walked. To understand the fate of female pirates after capture, it helps to glimpse the world they left, and the one they returned to, willingly or otherwise. In the early 18th century, a woman's role in much of Europe and its colonies was sharply defined. Her world was largely domestic, bound to marriage, childbearing, and religious observance. Education was limited, legal rights were sparse, respectability was currency, and deviation from it could mean social erasure. For most, piracy was not even a thought, let alone a choice. And yet, poverty has a way of unmaking propriety. In dockside communities like Port Royal, Tortuga, or the slums of London and Bristol, hunger often overpowered morality. Some women joined pirate crews not for adventure, but for survival. Others followed lovers or husbands to sea, or posed as boys to escape punishments ashore. A few like Qing Shi in 19th century China, whom we'll meet soon, would wield authority unmatched even by many male captains. But for the majority who remained behind, life on land was a slow, often invisible kind of endurance. In port towns, women kept inns, brewed beer, mended sails, and raised children alone while their partners disappeared into the surf. Some became informants, passing whispers to pirate hunters. Others acted as fences, helping sell stolen goods. A few, often widows or outcasts, became quiet pillars of pirate economies, exchanging safety for silence. And when female pirates were captured and returned to shore, this domestic world was rarely welcoming. Courts did not know what to do with them. Were they criminals, victims, disgraced women, or were they simply aberrations to be punished not only for theft and mutiny, but for the deeper crime of abandoning their prescribed place? Records show that captured women were sometimes released with warnings or fines, especially if they convinced the court they were coerced or had not wielded weapons. Others were imprisoned indefinitely, their names vanishing into the ledgers of forgotten jails. A rare few, like Mary Cricket or Martha Farley, were executed, their trials brief, their fates sealed not only by their piracy, but by the court's unease at their defiance. Public sentiment was equally uncertain. Pamphlets and broadsides from the time alternated between condemning and romanticizing female pirates. Some described them as unnatural, monstrous, or wicked beyond measure. Others presented them as titillating figures, dangerous, but fascinating. The line between scorn and spectacle was always thin. And yet, amidst all this, there was another truth, quieter and more enduring. Many women who returned from piracy, or who had merely brushed its edge, simply disappeared. They married, changed their names, took up mending or nursing or innkeeping. Some were likely never found out at all. They returned to a world that had not expected them, and had little space for their stories. But perhaps, in some dim corner of a quiet cottage, beside a hearth long since cold, a woman once looked out at the sea and remembered a time when she was someone else, someone freer, fiercer, and utterly unknown. And now, we set sail once more, not toward the Atlantic or the Caribbean, but eastward, where the South China Sea held a very different kind of pirate queen. Not all stories of female pirates end in anonymity or uncertain records. Some rise vast, undeniable above the tides of time, and among them, few loom as large or as quietly formidable as Qing Shi. Imagine, if you will, the South China Sea in the early 19th century, a vast, humid expanse threaded with trading routes, imperial ships, and fleets of sails both lawful and lawless. The scent of salt mingled with incense drifting from port temples. The wind carried the sound of bamboo flutes, as well as the more familiar creak of ships under strain. Born around 1775, Qing Shi began her life far from piracy. She was a Cantonese woman reportedly working aboard a floating brothel when she caught the attention of the pirate commander Zheng Yi. Upon their marriage, she joined him aboard his fleet, and when he died suddenly in 1807, she took control not as a figurehead, but as a commanding force. She did not disguise herself. She did not plead the belly or hide in the shadows of men. She ruled with structure, strategy, and a remarkable administrative mind. Under Qing Shi's leadership, the pirate confederation swelled to over 300 ships and perhaps as many as 20,000 sailors. Known as the Red Flag Fleet, they controlled large stretches of the South China Sea, imposing taxes on trade, raiding towns, and enforcing a strict pirate code. Her code forbade unauthorized raids and punished disobedience severely. Pillaging villages without approval was met with execution. Captured women were to be treated with respect. Rape was punishable by death. This structure, rare among pirate societies, helped maintain order in a fleet larger than many navies. But the real brilliance of Qing Shi lay in her ability to outmaneuver not just ships, but governments. When Chinese imperial forces, Portuguese navies, and even British warships attempted to stop her, she responded not with reckless battle, but with shrewd negotiation. By 1810, with pressure mounting, she walked into negotiations with imperial officials and emerged not in chains, but with an official pardon. Her fleet was largely absorbed into the Qing Navy. She kept her wealth, and she retired peacefully, opening a gambling house in Guangdong and living until at least 1844. Her fate stands in contrast to the tragic ends of so many others. She was not tried, imprisoned, or executed. She died of old age, a pirate who wrote her ending. Why was her story so different? Partly, it was power undeniable and well organized. Partly, it was cultural context. In Chinese society at the time, though still patriarchal, there existed space, albeit narrow, for women of influence, especially in times of social upheaval. And partly, It was Qingxi herself, a strategist, a negotiator, and a woman who understood both the brutality and fragility of order. Her legacy reminds us that piracy was not always chaos and storm sometimes. It was policy, diplomacy, and an iron grip beneath a calm exterior. As we leave the waters of the East behind, let us drift back to the wider picture. What happened across oceans and decades when women pirates were no longer feared but remembered? When their stories became symbols? We turn now to the evolution of their legacy. The sea forgets quickly. Storms smooth out footprints, and time softens names. Yet stories, when repeated enough, can float for centuries. And the women who once dared to pirate have been caught in a curious current, sometimes remembered, often romanticized, occasionally erased. When the age of piracy waned, and official navies reclaimed the waters, many female pirates, if acknowledged at all, became figures of novelty or moral warning. In 18th and 19th century England, popular ballads and penny pamphlets featured women like Anne Bonny and Mary Read as deviants or freaks of nature, stepping beyond their gender's bounds and suffering the consequences. These portrayals often emphasized their ferocity, their masculinity, or their supposed sexual promiscuity as if to explain or contain their rebellion. Victorian writers, in particular, took great interest in these women, but they stripped away much of the grit and reality, painting them in melodramatic tones, corseted sirens or fiery rebels, never quite human. The purpose was rarely historical clarity. Rather, it was entertainment, moral reflection, or subtle reinforcement of the norms the pirates once defied. For the women whose names did not survive, the printed page whose stories lived only in whispers or court documents, the erasure was more complete. Their lives became numbers in ledgers, anonymous entries in prison rolls, or unnamed passengers aboard vessels long since scuttled. But the 20th and 21st centuries have seen a gentle resurgence of interest. Historians, increasingly attentive to forgotten narratives, have begun combing through trial transcripts, naval records, and letters for traces of the women once glossed over. These efforts have brought nuance, a softer lens, more concerned with context than condemnation. Still, the boundary between history and myth remains porous. Fictional accounts, films, and television shows have shaped how the public perceives female pirates, bold, sultry, swashbuckling heroines who swing across decks and command storms. These images, though compelling, are often far from the truth. They flatten complexity. They rarely include the silence of isolation, the weight of secrecy, or the quiet terror of capture. Yet, even myths serve a function. They keep the stories afloat. When someone today hears the name Anne Bonny or Qingxi, they may not know the details, but they recognize the defiance. And within that recognition, however, blurred is a kind of survival. For the real women, legacy was never the goal. Most sought escape, not fame, safety, not legend. Their stories were stitched from desperation, ambition, and circumstance never designed to last. But lasting they are, in fragments and retellings, in re-examinations and reinterpretations. Each generation uncovers them again, asking not only, what did they do, but also, why did they disappear? Now, as the echoes of their memory continue to hum softly across time, we turn to those final, fateful crossroads, to what actually happened after the arrest, after the trial, when history fell silent and judgment fell hard. Let us now ease into the next shore, where the consequences truly took shape. When the sails fell slack and the chains clicked shut around their wrists, female pirates entered a different kind of peril, one not governed by tide or sword, but by courtrooms and cold decisions. Here, on dry land, they could no longer rely on disguise or the ambiguity of the sea. The law saw them, or rather, tried to make sense of them through a narrow lens. Trials were often swift. Pirates, male or female, were typically denied the full protections of legal counsel or extended defense. Proceedings took place in admiralty courts, where guilt was often presumed, and the main concern was the confirmation of identity and crimes. The gallows loomed large over every session. For women, however, the proceedings were more complicated. They defied societal expectations simply by having committed the crime. A woman in breeches, standing accused of piracy, was as much a social aberration as a criminal figure. The judges' responses varied. Some expressed scorn, others curiosity, still others a sense of confusion cloaked in severity. And yet, not all trials ended in execution. Some women, like Mary Cricket in 1729, were convicted and hanged, treated with the same harsh finality as their male counterparts. Cricket had participated in multiple acts of piracy along the West African coast, and her gender did not soften the sentence. Her execution, though recorded, was not dwelled upon in detail. Others, like Anne Bonny and Mary Read, as we've seen, pleaded the belly. This legal plea asserting pregnancy as a stay of execution required confirmation by a panel of midwives or matrons. If pregnancy was confirmed, execution was delayed until after the birth. Sometimes, this delay became indefinite. In rare cases, it offered a narrow passage to survival. There were also instances where women were acquitted or released quietly, particularly if their involvement in piracy was minimal, or if they were seen as coerced. Courts sometimes accepted claims of mistaken identity, or allowed women to portray themselves as victims of circumstance, rather than willing rogues. In colonial Spanish America, female pirates were more likely to be sentenced to domestic labor or imprisonment in convents, especially if they renounced piracy and showed signs of repentance. These punishments, while not as brutal as hanging, were still final in their own way, stripping freedom, agency, and identity. And yet, the most common fate of all may have been disappearance. For every name in a court record, there were likely others never recorded women who vanished into port towns under assumed names, who married sailors or merchants, or who returned to the shadows from which they came. Some were likely sold into indentured servitude, transported far from familiar shores. Others might have quietly returned home, never speaking of what they had done, their pasts folding away like sails at dusk. The silence is not accidental. It was survival. These women navigated a world that offered few second chances. When they escaped death, they often paid in anonymity. Their fates were sealed not in headlines or histories, but in forgetting. Still, even in this quiet ending, there is something enduring. The act of standing in court, of refusing to deny one's role, or of surviving through cleverness or sheer will, these left impressions, however faint, on the edge of the historical record. And now, with the hush of trials behind us, we arrive at our final harbour, to gently reflect on what it all means, and what comfort we might find in the slow fading of their stories into the deep blue of time. The sea has long been a place where boundaries blur. It erases tracks, reorders maps, and whispers through the lives of those who dare to step beyond the edges of the known. And for the women who became pirates willingly or otherwise, it offered a paradoxical kind of freedom, harsh, dangerous, but also strangely equalizing. Now, as we rest in the stillness beyond their capture, their trials, and their uncertain endings, we might ask, what remains? Not much, in terms of solid records. Few letters, fewer graves, no monuments. The women of the waves left behind more questions than answers, and perhaps that is part of their power. Their stories, pieced together from trial transcripts, rumors and fragments, remind us that history is not always made of grand declarations. Sometimes it is built on decisions made in fear or hope, a stolen uniform, a hidden identity, a whispered agreement to join a crew. Some female pirates sought adventure, others sought escape. Some likely hoped for coin or glory or merely a chance to choose their own way in a world that offered few paths. And when they were captured, punished, or disappeared, their legacies did not end, they shifted. They moved into folk songs, into whispered stories passed between sailors, into the imaginations of those who dream of distant coasts and forbidden lives. In modern times, their images have been pulled into new shapes. The fierce, beautiful pirate queen, the rebel against injustice, the symbol of female empowerment. These are echoes not untrue, but not the whole truth either. They are the outlines left when history has rubbed away the finer lines. But perhaps, in this gentle blur, there is a kind of justice. The women who once lived behind masks and under flags of danger now drift in myth, their names carried like sea foam on stories retold across generations. They are not just figures of rebellion. They are reminders of how complex people can be, how survival takes many forms, and how even those who leave no trace can bend the course of memory. So as you rest here, at the edge of their stories, listen to the hush between waves. It is there in that space, that their lives continue, not loudly, but with persistence, not glorified, but remembered. And now, we draw the sails in. The sea grows quiet again. The shore is near. Let us gently close this journey. You followed us through waters once troubled, now calm across distant coasts and forgotten trials, through stories half written and lives half remembered. From the creaking decks of disguised sailors, to the stormless power of Qing Shi, to the hush of forgotten names carved into prison walls, we've explored not just history, but its silence. And in that silence, perhaps, there is a kind of peace. Tonight, as your thoughts drift, know that these women, though few, though blurred, did exist. They challenged the roles given to them. They risked their lives on uncertain tides. And whether they were remembered or not, their choices left ripples. Now, the past grows dim. The lantern is low. The tide is still. Rest easy. You are safe, far from storm or chase. The pirates sleep now, and so may you. Good night.